So in 1916, you started your archive of UAE's art history, and so in more generally the Gulf region, and you covered 40 years of history across 4 generations. Can you walk us through the different artistic and cultural scenes in the Gulf since the late 60s? And
Sure.
we'll start with Kuwait.
Great. So just to give you, to backtrack,
Yeah.
how I was able to, look into, let's say, the Gulf, because my major focus in my thesis was on UAE art history. Many of these artists, many people who I, have interviewed that are based here were educated in Kuwait. Many of the, obviously they're at the time, let's say in the 60s, 70s, Kuwait was sending textbooks to the UAE. There was a lot of educational links. A lot of artists went to, whether it was primary school in Kuwait, and a few went to Kuwait even for their theater, their theater school, which was very important at the time. And so many of these artists, like Abdul Rahim, who's Emirati, grew up as a child there. Kuwait at the time in 1960 had Marsam al-Hor, which was the free art atelier that was sponsored by the government, that actually allocated a certain amount of funding to the artists. It provided, the tools, the paint, all the paint material to the artists, which was very important. I mean, when you really look at many of these art communities across the Gulf, it was always important to see, where were artists receiving their paint supplies. And so you have Marsam al-Hor, which, and another one that you're showing is Sultan Gallery, which was opened in 1969 by a brother and sister, Najat and Ghazi Sultan. And this really was, in terms of pioneering, putting the Gulf, particularly obviously Kuwait, on the map in the region, was so important. I mean, you had particularly the Sultan Gallery, was the Ghazi and Najat were very well aware and informed of the art scene throughout the region, traveling to Beirut, traveling to Casablanca, traveling to Damascus, Baghdad, and they were committed to promoting modern artists in the gallery space. So you have here, this was, a major exhibition. Both locals and foreigners attended the exhibition. And this one, to this day, I mean, it remains a very, very important show that started, artists like Dia Azawi, artists like Shakir Hassan al-Said, another Iraqi artist, came. Mohammed Malahi, the Moroccan artist, exhibited here. So in terms of the importance of Sultan Gallery as being, a commercial gallery space, as a center, and then having, the Plastic Art Society that was formed in late 1960s, outside of just the free art atelier, that, showcased all of the local artists at the time, had exhibitions, delivering workshops. It was really a space that, artists could congregate and practice their work.
Their work, yeah. And so, talking about work, here we have 3 works from Kuwaiti artists.
Yes, so here are a few: Khalifa Al-Qattan, Jawad Boushahri, and Sami Mohammed, just to name a few. The Khalifa studied in the UK in the 1950s. He founded the Circalism movement, was one of the first members of the Free Art Atelier, and he was founded Circalism based on, spirituality and philosophy, but very important in terms of art educating. Sami Mohammed, also part of the Free Art Atelier, and he had studied in the US, and they, basically, when you really make all of the artists, they were sent abroad, many of them on government scholarships, whether within the region, studying locally. I mean, it really depends, and that's always what makes it so interesting to see those artists that studied abroad, how they were influenced by, you know, other art communities at the time. And then Jawad Bouchari, another one, famous sculptor, who actually was a teacher for Abdul Qadir al-Rais, and he was connected with Rassam al-Hor, found in 1982 a gallery as well. So Sami Mohammed was one of the first artists to be represented by in the Venice Biennale. Yeah, so all of them, and in terms of their connections within the Gulf is, you know, very, in terms of being exhibiting throughout the region is numerous, and internationally. I mean, Khalifa al-Qattan was in Beijing at one point, and Sami Mohammed had one of his first traveling exhibitions in Sharjah. So they're very well known throughout the region.
Throughout the region. And then we have Saudi Arabia.
Yes, so then we have Saudi.
Yeah.
I wanted to share, this one is another, you know, very interesting in terms of, let's say the 1960s was one of the first, Abdul Rahim Radwi had one of his first exhibitions in the mid-1960s. And you find another, you know, groups of artists that started the Saudi art house. And then you have, you know, artists that were studying abroad, like Safia bin Zaghar, who was in, she studied in Egypt, and then she studied in Central St. Martin's, came back. The Saudi art house in particular was founded by Mohammed al-Saleem, and he had worked, you know, with Abdul Rahim Radwi. They were, you know, working during the same time. Yeah. And that was another space that was very important, providing free art supplies to artists at the time. Yeah.
So you mentioned Mohammed al-Saleem here, that we can see.
These are, you know, it just kind of sheds a light on the traveling exhibitions that many of these artists did. On the left, you have Mohammed al-Saleem on the right side, Abdul Rahim Suleiman on the left, in Washington, D.C. in the 90s. You know, and as I had mentioned, Mohammed al-Saleem studied in Italy. You know, Abdul Rahim Radwi studied in Italy as well. In terms of their exposure internationally, was very important as well.
And here we have two works from Imam and al-Saleem. Can you tell us a bit more about these artworks?
Particularly, al-Saleem started horizontalism. He studied in Italy. He came back and started to incorporate his own, based on the abstract landscapes of the desert scenes that he was looking into. You find a lot of artists incorporate, it's something I'm sure is, you know, with looking throughout the region, studying in the West, incorporating whatever types of styles it may have been, Cubism, yeah, Romanticism, Realism, and then you have Surrealism, and you know, then the conceptual movements. So you see visually some similarities, but really the beauty is you know, incorporating the local visual vernacular within their works.
Here, now Abdul Nasser Gharin, who is more contemporary.
Yes, so now you have a shift, and it's you know, it's an interesting one, from the modernism to semi, in a way. You know, I mean, you have many different generations. This exhibition Shatta was in 2003 in Al-Maftaha Art in Abha in the south. And this really puts, Abdul Nasser was very familiar with Hassan Sharif, with these artists, the conceptual movement. And he learned a lot through online. And he was lieutenant colonel in the Saudi army. And this was the, you know, the artist that I had met a few years back, and who really influenced me and inspired me to kind of focus specifically on this. But he and a few other artists poets exhibited these very conceptual works, and you know, it kind of put them on the map in terms of the conceptual art movement in Saudi. So it's and he has his studio, arm studio, and inspiring the younger generation and like incubating the creative art scene in Saudi right now. I helped Abdul Nasser and his group in an exhibition in San Francisco, which was really exciting to see the works that he did. There was one of his most important works, Sirat, the Path, kind of focusing, you know, on these aspects of parallel lines and what society is following, and you know, you could see it even in these concrete blocks that the artist is doing, and use of stamps and very bureaucratic stamp aesthetic that he uses. So I think, you know, this movement, this Shatta group influenced so much and was part of, you know, at the same time in 2003, you know, you have the circle movements happening in Oman, and you have, you know, Hassan Sharif and his group that were meeting together. So you find all these communities were somehow all existing at the same time and were aware of each other.
And then we go to Bahrain, and you specifically worked on this artist, Abdul Rahim Sharif.
I know the artist. I know his son well. He's, for me, a great memory to meet in Bahrain at the time when I was on my scholarship, because he's had considerable time in New York, studied at Parsons School. Before that, he studied École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so he is a very interesting figure who has truly internationalized, you know, in terms of his inspiration, you know, going between Paris and then going to New York, and you know, he's based in Bahrain now. His influences range, you know, from looking at the local landscape to you know, more abstract scenes, figurative scenes, portraits. So this one, yeah, I'm very, then a lot of fun archival photographs that I have of his days traveling.
Can you tell us a bit more about his experience in Paris and what kind of, like, he might?
Sure, I know. So he went on a scholarship there in the late 70s. He actually won a prize for, you know, a work that he had done, you know, a very fast moving work on paper that he had done. Yeah, that was during his time in Paris.
Yes, yeah. So in 1971, the United Arab Emirates formed and became an important cultural artistic hub and artistic hub in the region. How this hub developed since 1971?
So to give you, I guess, the background, because between when the UAE was founded till when the Emirates Fine Arts Society was founded, before that, many artists traveled abroad. So the pioneer group that I focused on studied abroad in more or less the late 1970s. And at the time, they would come back when they returned, and they were discussing, let's say in the Sharjah National Theatre or these other groups, how they were going to coalesce and form a group, you know, and kind of band together and incorporate what they were learning from abroad, and build, you know, an art scene. So these photos in particular is the old Emirates Fine Arts Society building. And the 1984, this was a group of, you know, you could see, I can make out a few artists, Dr. Mohammed Yusuf, I see Hassan Sharif. So all of them, you know, and I love the sense of the community and the communal gathering of the artists. So it was the first exhibition, 1981. So, you know, in terms of these art societies, all throughout, of course, particularly for the Emirates Fine Arts Society, I wish, Arthur, I was like a fly on the wall during that time to hear all of the conversations, you know, about art, about history, about, you know, society. Because mind you, I mean, something to really take into account were the challenges. I mean, to really think how a group of artists formed across the Gulf, you know,
Yeah.
and decided, despite the challenges, to be artists, you know. And so you look at this photo now, we're in the art scene now, so it looks very familiar to us, but at the time it was very difficult and so challenging. The more that, you know, I'm speaking to many of these artists to continue. His Highness Sheikh Dr. Sultan Al-Qasimi on the left with Abdul Rahim Sharif, and I have to say His Highness in Sharjah so promoted the art scene and starting the art scene and giving a hope to many of these artists, giving them a place at the Emirates Fine Arts Society, being a patron for these artists, which was so important. You have on the lower right, many of the artists, this is actually Bahraini artists that came to the UAE. Sheikh Rashid bin Khalifa is in the middle, and Abdul Rahim Sharif is on the left. And this, you know, it was in the mid '80s that, you know, the artists came, which is great to see. And so you'd have these national annual Emirates Fine Arts Society exhibitions, and that was really the place that, you know, was the standard exhibitions that people would go. It was originally at the Sharjah Expo, and you'd have these exhibitions, and you'd have the exhibition catalogs that, you know, I was looking through. You had Tashkil magazine that was started in 1984. So, you know, and you find each scene throughout the Gulf had their own, you know, and particularly here, this is Najat Makki, Dr. Najat Makki and Dr. Mohammed Yusuf in Italy. And they were, you know, in many of these international exhibitions, showing, you know, many of these were newly formed countries, so kind of showing the heritage of the UAE. On the lower right, you have Hassan Sharif and Khalil Abdul Wahid in, I believe that was Marija's studio. And Hassan Sharif was very important, Beit Sarkal. Hassan Sharif was very important, obviously, as a pioneering artist, but as an educator. So, you know, as I mentioned, Hassan formed the basis of my research and provided a lot of context. He is probably one of the most notable figures in the Gulf region, really, in terms of what he has done in spearheading the art scene, in challenging pre-existing notions of what art is. Mind you, there are many different schools and centers of you know, different movements that transpired, but in terms of the conceptual art movement, Hassan is really a forefather for it. He studied in the Bayam Shah School of Art in the mid '80s. He came back, and no, he came back in the early '80s after studying, which now is the Central St. Martin's School in the UK, and he was part of the, you know, this group of artists at the time, but was very influenced in conceptual movements, surrealist movements, and so he would come back, you know, in the summers in between when he was studying abroad, and would photograph him jumping in the deserts and swinging and doing a lot of these different conceptual works. And so Hassan really sparked, he would come back, so this was particularly the early 1980s works that he did, his performances, and his semi-system works that he actually would measure based on matrices, his body on squares that he would actually physically lay down on and have someone photograph him. He was jumping in deserts. Hassan and a group of artists were very spearheading Tashkil magazine in 1984 that was used as really an art historical resource for artists. He was translating books from, you know, Western art history books into Arabic. So he's a very important figure for the UAE. This is another, he did a lot of found objects, backpacks, sneakers.
Is it specific to this?
Is it specific to?
his work, his art?
Yes, yes. He, in terms of collecting, this, you know, it's another part of his work that he does, but he would hoard and go into, you know, and get works, you know, pieces, sorry, out of ready-made objects. Marcel Duchamp was a huge inspiration for many of these artists, particularly Hassan. Using ready-mades was very important. He had, in 1985, it was a one-day exhibition that was this very avant-garde exhibition in Sharjah, where he just, and many artists, poets like Khalid al-Budur, came, and it was a very monumental exhibition, and he placed rocks and certain objects around, and it was so conceptual at the time. And so yeah.
And another artist that he worked on is Saleh al-Ustad, who is actually a very important figure in the Emirati art scene.
Yes, unfortunately, Allah yarhamu, he passed away, and there are certain points, I think, in my research, you know, unfortunately, that are going to happen more often, you know, as many years that I'm starting to do this and learn. And Hassan Sharif passed away right before I embarked on my scholarship that I framed my thesis on, and you realized how important these, you know, primary source documents are, these interviews, these recordings. I interviewed Saleh through Dr. Mohammed Youssef, who was one of the first chairmen of the Emirates Art Society. And I went and visited Saleh in his home, and unexpectedly, you know, I never was focusing on photographers. It was always towards painters or sculptors, and I knew very little about photography. I did very little photography. I'm now doing a lot of sunrise photography shoots on my own, and I think it really came through meeting Saleh. Now, what the beauty with Saleh was, he studied in the US. He was one of part of that first batch to really go and study in the US in the late 1970s. He went to Missouri as like an intensive English school at the time in 1979, and then went to Chapman College in California and was exposed to the light and space movement in California, was part of the art scene there. Came back to the UAE in the mid-1980s and started the first darkroom in the Emirates Fine Arts Society. At the time, I mean, all of the the challenges of being a photographer, especially at that time, were very difficult. But he was always interested in overexposing, using the darkroom, using analog photography, and producing his works. So this one particular, Divorce, is a very important work documenting one of the relatives in the family, and yeah, he had a darkroom in his home, but the amount of stories that I've learned from him were just unbelievable. And he really is the forefather for the photography scene, and unfortunately his story was not really told. Not many people know of him, and it was the same thing with another artist who passed away, Mohammed, who passed away before I really had a chance to meet or to know much about him. So I did a short, like a 20-minute feature film or small length video segment on him, which was really special. So I was able to film him and capture many of the stories that he had. And I think the beauty with him is that he lived an American life. I have a lot of archival photos of him cutting pumpkins during Halloween, traveling to Washington, D.C. with the Washington Monument. And it's just so lovely to see and special, and interlinks my life with someone like him. And I think about where my family was in the 70s was not so far away from where he is, or many of these artists that were studying abroad. So I think that's the beauty, of seeing how international these artists were.
Yeah. And then we have some artworks here from contemporary Emirati artists.
So I could start from the lower right. Ahmed Ansari. This work was one of the very important work that was at the Venice Biennale Sheikh Ahur Al-Qasimi in 2015 had highlighted, these pioneer artists, and they actually used this. Dr. Mohammed was telling me to literally beg and ask for, an art society to be founded. So this was produced in 1979, and it's, a very important, iconic work for that reason. Mohammed Kazem, his works on scratchings on paper. Mohammed is another one that was taught at a very young age by Hassan Sharif in terms of documenting the changing landscape of the art scene using photography. He did a lot of painting, was very, very important also in terms of educating the younger generation, such as artists like Abdul Qadir al-Rais on the left. This is another one of his works from his Impressionist series. You find, there is such a mix of works, whether they're inspired by, as I mentioned, Impressionism, Realism, Cubism, conceptualist types of works. Upper left, Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim is an artist from Horfakan in the northern UAE, and he uses a lot of found objects, collage, and creates these beings, if you will. They're like his friends. I visited him, and he was in Horfakan with another artist, Abdul Sadi, who actually studied in Japan. And both of them, in terms of, I think the older artists are very active outdoors, and you find across the Gulf, documenting the changing landscape, documenting how fast evolving, how so much has changed in terms of the infrastructure physically, and how that is internalized. So you find, many different movements, many different aesthetics.
Mm-hmm. And then the last country that we're going to talk about is Oman. And we have
Oman.
here a beautiful picture from the first Muscat Biennale.
Yes. So Oman, the artist at the time, I'll briefly, highlight Anwar Sonia, who actually studied in the UK, who is very friendly with artists like Abdul Qadir al-Rais, and he had the Omani Fine Arts Society was also around. It was more like early 1980s, but particularly with Oman, which is in parallel, let's say, to the conceptual art movement that transpired with Hassan Sharif and his group. You have the Circle exhibition in the early 2000s. Hassan Mir, who is an artist that studied in Savannah College of Fine Arts and Design in the US, came back, and they started putting up these very conceptual exhibitions. Yes, so Hassan Mir, Anwar Sonia, in terms of documenting the local scene, Anwar had maybe a bit more, this here is a bit more abstract, but classical in terms of what he was, very similar in ways to Abdul Qadir al-Rais. Hassan Mir documenting a lot of the changing society, a lot of what was happening during the time of, rebuilding and shifting in practice, and in terms of documenting a lot of the buildings, demolished buildings that were being changed, and reconstruction. And so there was a lot of correspondence between, Hassan and the Circle group and UAE artists as well.
Mm. So now that we have an overview of the art from the region, from the Gulf region, do you think it's possible to make connections with artists from the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East? Because you were saying that all of these artists from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc., went abroad. They studied there, and then they came back to their countries, and they started founding artists groups and movements, and that was the same path that the artists from Egypt, from Syria or Lebanon. Do you think it's possible to make I mean, is there any connections with these two parts of the big Middle East?
Of course, and this is, you know, what's, I think my time working at Christie's now has helped prompt further this research, because, you know, many of these artists, whether they were studying or participating in exhibitions, there was definitely connections, an exchange of, you know, whatever it was when they were traveling. Many of these artists studied, let's say in Cairo. You have artists studying in Baghdad. They were young at the time, they're in university, but you find, you know, even reading, let's say through Tashkil magazine, references to the Egyptian Surrealist movement that happened in Egypt, you know, let's say like the 1930s, late 1930s. Dr. Najat Maki, who was based here, studied in Cairo and, you know, knew about Adam Hanain. Of course, you know, there's many artists that naturally, you know, are going to be, you have artists like Dia Azawi, who is in Kuwait, and that, you know, many artists are well aware. So I would definitely say that, you know, there is an understanding of what was happening regionally at the time. And I'd be curious, you know, as part of how to further my research, of finding correspondence. And for me, a lot of primary material was these exhibition catalogs that were important, and then finding, you know, certain art periodicals like Tashkil magazine that are actually artists writing about this time. Definitely you'll find, you know, they were aware about other artists at the time.
Suzy, you are also art specialist at Christie's in Dubai, and I'd like to know how Christie's impact your like, how does Christie's impact your research?
Sure. Well, I think naturally, you know, we're an auction house, and as much as we are learning about artists, we also are speaking to collectors who are, who are as informed, if not more informed sometimes, about many of the artists, whether they knew these artists personally, whether they're, whoever it is, if it's the, you know, we're speaking to the grandson or the actual collector of the work. And that is a whole other part of what makes, I think, you know, I work at Christie's. We started 2006. There was a lot of dialogue in artist estates with the artists, with artist families. As you know, Valerie Didier and how she produced the catalog Raisonné for Mahmoud Said. It's so important when you're working at an auction house, especially for the Middle East, particularly to wear the hats as both, you know, working in the art business, but also being, you know, an art researcher at the same time. And so, you know, you find many different stories. I mean, many of these collectors will have with them books and pamphlets of, you know, for instance, like there was this collector in the US who had a work by Zainab Abdul Hamid, who's the Egyptian artist. And he had this Venice Biennale exhibition book from the 1950s, and the work was illustrated in it. And it was like, that's now in Dalloul Art's collection. And it was so exciting. You know, you find there's so many treasure troves of stories and photographs that you could find through this, but definitely in terms of with Christie's, it's helped me give a context, because naturally the works that we've sold a few artists from the Gulf region. We're expanding to do so in time, but the basis of many of the works that we sell are you know, the modern Iraqi works, modern Lebanese, Egyptian, that really form the basis and give the context to a lot of the research that I'm doing now.
Mm-hmm. And what are your next projects?
My next projects, I definitely, I mean, in terms of focusing on the Gulf and expanding to really look into interviewing more artists and mapping. I mean, unfortunately with the quarantine, I'm not going to be able to travel just yet. But there's a lot of work to be done. I'm really focusing on rebranding and my mini start to look at really telling stories and seeing where these, you know, the Golden series takes me, or, you know, these other series that I've been working on, and seeing where it goes. But I think, you know, the beauty is, at this point, I've found and channeled my inner passion, which is interviewing artists. And with that, at the same time, I think meeting artists, you're introduced to a whole group of creatives and a collective of an art scene that you cannot negate or you cannot neglect when you're, you know, you have to be well informed of the poets and the writers, and it's a whole, you know, menagerie of people that you need to be well informed about. I'm an eternal learner. I'm learning every day. I'm learning from you. I'm learning from my peers, from my fellow researchers, from my colleagues, because at the end of the day, there is so much to be done. For me, I'm always learning. There's so much to be done, and so many breakthroughs to happen, you know. And I think that's the beauty with being an art specialist, especially at an auction house, finding these hidden gems, these hidden masterpieces that you'll never know about, and you know, you find them, which is really exciting. There is a lot of work to be done, and I'm just grateful for being able to speak with so many artists who have given me, who have trusted me in terms of sharing with me their stories, being so transparent and genuine with me. I've gone to this point. It hasn't been easy, Arthur. You know, it's for me, traveling halfway across the world and not knowing anything about the region, and somehow finding so many parallels to my life, and to the way, let's say, back home to here. And I think that's the most special part, is bridging regions together, which is great. And the most special part about my research really is when I meet artists who are older pioneer artists, and I am giving them a platform through them sharing with me their stories, because many artists will some of them will just kind of, and I've had this where they've never told this to other people before, and I'm like so curious and so intrigued, and just providing them, you know, a platform to share their comments, and it's been a special and a lifelong pursuit.
Thank you, Suzy, for sharing your amazing work, research work, and I really wish you the best for your next projects.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for this opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.